My name is Marlene, and for most of my life, I tried to convince myself that what my parents gave me was enough. Not love, not warmth, just barely enough to survive. But everything changed the day I left my son Caleb in their care for what was supposed to be 3 safe temporary days. What happened next wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. They didn't hit him. They didn't scream. They simply didn't feed him. For 2 days, a 7-year-old child sat at their table and watched them eat while his plate stayed empty. And when I learned the truth, I didn't explode, I rewrote the rules. Because if they could starve my son of dignity, I would starve them of the thing they craved most. But before I tell you how it all unraveled, I want to ask, where are you watching from? And how old were you when someone first taught you that being family doesn't always mean being loved? Subscribe to Subtle Revenge Stories for more true stories that hit where it hurts. They never hit me. That's what I used to repeat to myself when the silence got too loud, when I'd walk into a room and feel my mother's disappointment without her ever saying a word. That's what I told myself when my father would speak to Melissa with warmth and ease, then turn to me with the cold restraint of a man talking to a stranger he didn't quite trust. They didn't hit me. So I convinced myself it wasn't abuse. But silence can cut deeper than a slap, and favoritism, it strangles you slowly, the kind that makes you second-guess your worth even when you're doing everything right. Growing up in that house meant earning every scrap of attention. And most days I left the table still starving, but I swallowed it. I learned to keep quiet to make myself small. I graduated, got a job, moved out. I thought that would be enough. And for a while, I believed I had outrun the damage until I had my son, Caleb. He came into the world soft-voiced and wide-eyed, with a love for books and peanut butter sandwiches. Suddenly, all the wounds I had tucked away began to throb again. Every time I looked at him, I saw innocence that deserved protection. And just like that, the bar was raised. I couldn't let him grow up the way I did, confused by conditional love, always trying to be enough. That's when I started setting boundaries. I kept my parents at arm's length, polite, distant, controlled. They met Caleb maybe once or twice a year and only under my watch. Of course, Melissa's kids were there all the time. They had bedrooms at my parents' house, toys in the garage, their photos on the fireplace mantel. And I told myself that was fine. I didn't need that kind of love. But I was lying. Deep down, I hoped that maybe becoming a grandparent would melt something inside them. That they'd soften. That they'd see Caleb and recognize what they never saw in me. It was a quiet hope one I never voiced because I was too afraid of how hollow it might ring. Then came the call. Our apartment's wiring failed. The landlord's neglect finally caught up with the place, and just like that, we were out. Insurance would cover a hotel, but the family housing waitlist was weeks long. I was trying to figure out our next move when the phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was unusually pleasant. "Bring Caleb here," she said. "We've got room." In the background, I could hear my father grunt in agreement, like it cost him something just to acknowledge the idea. She added, "We'll treat him like our own." There was a pause. "Just until you get back on your feet." I hesitated. Something in my chest tightened. But I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe they could change even for a little while. So I said yes. Tell me honestly, have you ever said yes to something you knew deep down you might regret? It wasn't flames that drove me to their doorstep. It was uncertainty pressing in from all sides. I remember standing in our hallway, the smell of burnt insulation still clinging to Caleb's backpack, holding the notice from the fire inspector. Uninhabitable until further inspection. Just like that, we were in limbo. I'd always prided myself on being the one who planned ahead, the responsible one. But no amount of planning prepares you for a moment when your child looks up and asks, "Where are we sleeping tonight?" I could have crumbled. Instead, I smiled and said, "It's just a little adventure." That night, we slept in the car behind a 24-hour grocery store. I kept the engine running so the air conditioner wouldn't quit, and I wrapped my jacket around Caleb's legs. He didn't complain once. He just leaned into me and whispered, "I miss my books." That's when I checked my voicemail and heard my mother's message again. "Bring Caleb here. We've got room." I stared at the ceiling of the car, listening to her voice. Soft, practiced, like she'd been rehearsing it. For a brief moment, I imagined Caleb in a real bed, showered full, sleeping under a roof not made of steel and glass. By morning, my exhaustion had worn down my hesitation. I called her back. "Just for a few days," I said. She replied, "Of course, we understand." I don't know why, but I felt the need to explain myself as if my struggle required permission. I told her I'd bring groceries, a full bag of food for Caleb labeled with his allergies, his preferences, even his bedtime snacks. I typed up an instruction sheet like I was handing him over to a school nurse. Everything felt fragile, even the goodbye. When we arrived, the house looked exactly the same as it had when I left it a decade ago. Pristine lawn wind chimes by the porch, the same wreath on the door Melissa had gifted them last Christmas. Caleb was quiet. "It's big," he said. "Too big." My mother greeted us with a smile that barely reached her eyes. She bent down and hugged Caleb stiffly. My father stayed seated on the couch, only raising his hand in a half-hearted wave. "Hey, kid," he said, then turned back to the news. I walked Caleb through everything in the fridge I'd brought. Peanut butter bananas, whole wheat bread. I handed over the allergy list again, even though I'd emailed it the night before. My mom nodded, distracted. "Got it," she said, folding the paper and tucking it somewhere near the sink. I kissed Caleb goodbye and told him I'd call every evening. He smiled, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He was trying to be brave for me. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror until the house disappeared. Something sat heavy in my chest, a weight I couldn't name. But I pushed it down. I told myself this was just for a few days. That I was doing the right thing. That I could trust them at least with this. Looking back now, I have to ask, have you ever mistaken a quiet voice for safety, only to find out it was silence masking a trap? I packed like I was preparing Caleb for war. Every Ziploc bag was labeled, every snack balanced. I even tucked in a note with a cartoon sun that said, "You're my favorite person in the world." He loved little surprises like that. I didn't want him to feel like I was abandoning him even for a few days. But behind every careful fold of his clothes, behind each allergy-safe snack, and extra pair of socks, was a feeling I didn't want to admit. Guilt. And not the kind that fades with time. The kind that festers. When I became a mother, something rewired inside me. I started seeing my childhood not as isolated memories, but as patterns. Patterns I hadn't noticed when I was young, too busy surviving to analyze. Now, every time I watched Caleb flinch at loud voices or hesitate before asking for something, I'd freeze. Was I passing it on? Was I making him feel small the way I used to feel? That question haunted me more than any failure, so I overcompensated. I became the mother who pre-planned playdates, who packed lunches like care packages, who read bedtime stories with voices for every character. And maybe, just maybe, I thought that if I did it all perfectly, I could shield him from the cracks that still echoed inside me. But perfection is brittle. It doesn't bend when life hits you. And when the apartment went up in smoke, so did my illusion of control. That's why I packed so much for him. Groceries, schedules, notes, reassurances. Like if I gave my parents enough tools, they wouldn't have to rely on instinct. Because I knew what their instincts were. Cold, performative, conditional. But I kept hoping. Maybe this was their chance to rewrite the script. Maybe they'd see the child I raised, this thoughtful, curious little boy, and realize what a gift he was. Before I left, I knelt down and looked Caleb in the eyes. "If anything feels weird," I said, "you call me." "Okay." He nodded. "Like what kind of weird?" I smiled, but it didn't reach my chest. "Like if anyone makes you feel small." Or if you get hungry and no one listens. He tilted his head. That won't happen here, right? I hesitated half a second too long. Of course not, I said, brushing his hair back. This is just for a little while. I hugged him longer than I should have. My mother stood by the door, tapping her fingers against the frame like she had somewhere more important to be. My father never came out to say goodbye. He stayed planted in front of the TV, the hum of sports commentary replacing any gesture of care. I got in the car, hands trembling. As I pulled away, Caleb waved with both arms still smiling. He trusted me. That trust is what I held on to when the doubts crept in like ivy growing between the bricks of a house you thought was solid. And as the driveway disappeared in my rearview mirror, I whispered to myself, "Please prove me wrong." Tell me, have you ever begged life to prove your instincts wrong, only to realize they were warning you all along? By the third day, something in my gut unraveled. I hadn't slept well since dropping Caleb off, and the voicemail updates from my mom were vague at best. He's fine, she'd say. Quiet, but fine. That word quiet clanged in my ear like a warning bell. Caleb was many things thoughtful shy at first, but never truly quiet once he felt safe. His voice had music in it. Stories. Wonder. So I called. When he picked up, I knew immediately something was wrong. His tone was flat, not tired, but dimmed, like someone had drawn the blinds over his spark. "Hey, buddy," I said, trying to sound upbeat. "How are you?" A pause. "Okay," he replied. I asked what he'd eaten that day. Another pause. Longer. "Some crackers," he said softly. "Just crackers." My chest tightened. "Did Grandma make breakfast?" Silence. Then almost a whisper, Papa said, "Lunch is for family, and I'm just visiting." The phone nearly slipped from my hand. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the white-hot flash of disbelief. No, they didn't. But I knew they did. I didn't ask more questions. I didn't wait for explanations. I ended the call, grabbed my keys, and drove through the night. My hands gripped the wheel until my knuckles went white, and every red light felt like betrayal. I got there just after dawn. The sun was just beginning to spill over their manicured lawn when I pulled into the driveway. I didn't bother knocking. I walked in like I used to when I still lived there, unwelcome but too familiar to be stopped. The smell hit me first. Sausage, pancakes, eggs. My stomach turned. I walked into the kitchen and found my father mid-bite halfway through a stack of pancakes. My mother was sipping coffee, flipping through a magazine like this was a lazy Sunday. Caleb sat at the far end of the table, his plate empty, his eyes hollow. "Where's his food?" I asked, voice sharp. My mother didn't even blink. "He already ate," she said without looking up. Caleb shook his head, barely audible. "No, I didn't," my father snorted. "He had crackers yesterday. He's not starving." He said it like that justified everything. I stared at my son. Pale. Slumped. Shrinking into himself like he'd learned it was safer not to exist too loudly. Rage welled in me, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that burns slow and permanent. "Why would you say he's not family?" I asked, trembling. My mother rolled her eyes. "Because he's not. He's your kid. We didn't sign up for this." "He's 7, I said, voice cracking. 7. You think punishing a child is normal?" My father stood slowly. "No one's punishing him, but he's not entitled to anything. Not like Melissa's kids. They're here every week." And just like that, the mask slipped. The favoritism I had lived under my whole life now aimed at my son. That's when I knew we weren't just visitors. We were reminders. Unwelcome, unwanted, disposable. Tell me, have you ever heard someone say something so heartless about your child that you knew right then nothing would ever be the same again? I didn't yell. I didn't throw the plate like some dramatic scene in a movie. That would have been too easy and too much like them. Instead, I walked to Caleb, bent down, and whispered, "We're leaving." He looked up at me, startled at first, then nodded without a word. His little hands reached for mine like they'd been waiting for the signal to escape. I picked up his backpack, the one they hadn't even unpacked, and slung it over my shoulder. My mother glanced up more annoyed than alarmed. "You're seriously making a scene over snacks," she said, as if crackers were all this was about. But it wasn't the crackers. It was the message behind them. Caleb hadn't just been denied food. He'd been denied belonging, denied warmth, denied the basic right to feel safe in a place called family. I didn't turn around. I didn't explain. I didn't owe them a single word more. I walked out the door with my son and never stepped foot in that house again. We drove in silence for a while. I kept checking on him in the rearview mirror. He stared out the window, his small face expressionless. We stopped at a diner just off the highway. He used to love pancakes. I ordered him a short stack extra bananas on top the way he liked them. He poked at them with his fork but didn't eat. "My stomach hurts," he mumbled. That broke me more than anything else. Not because he was sick, but because he had been conditioned in just 2 days to expect nothing. To not even believe he was allowed to be hungry. I held it together until we got home. Then I locked the door, sat at our kitchen table, and cried into my hands. Guilt, fury, shame. Not just at them for what they did, but at myself for ever thinking they'd be different. For handing my son over to people who had once taught me silence was safer than truth. That night, I tried to talk to Caleb about it. "What happened at Grandma's?" I asked gently. He shook his head. "Can we not?" he whispered. And I respected that. I didn't push. But inside, I made a vow. I would never let him feel that small again. I would not let their shadows stretch into his life like they had into mine. So I made a list. I sat down and wrote out everything they loved: Melissa's attention, their social status, their antique teacups, their holiday parties, and at the end of that list, I wrote one more thing: my silence. That was the real currency. That's what they had always counted on. My silence is what had kept them powerful, respectable, untouched. That night, I decided to take that currency back. I would starve them the way they starved my son, not of food, but of image illusion control. Because if they couldn't feed a child, they didn't deserve to be fed praise. And if they thought they could erase us quietly, they were about to learn what silence can really do when it finally speaks. Now let me ask, have you ever realized that the most powerful revenge isn't noise, but absence? The waitress smiled politely when she placed the pancakes in front of Caleb. He just stared at them. His fork rested beside the plate untouched. The smell of syrup, once his favorite, made his nose wrinkle. I watched him try to hide it, but it was there, the hesitation, the shrinking. I said nothing at first. I let him sit. Let him decide if he felt safe enough to eat. Minutes passed. He finally picked up the fork and took a small bite, like someone testing if the food might disappear if he reached for too much. Then he looked up at me and whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't finish. I nearly lost it." I reached across the table, held his hand, and said, "You never ever have to be sorry for being hungry." But that's what 2 days in their house had taught him to apologize for needing something as basic as food. It wasn't just hunger they had inflicted, it was shame. It wrapped itself around his small shoulders like a heavy coat. And suddenly I saw it all for what it was: not a misunderstanding, not forgetfulness, but cruelty, disguised as indifference. A test to see how much he would take before he broke. After we got home, I tried to tuck it away. I told myself I needed rest, that the worst was over. But my body refused peace. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Caleb's empty plate. I heard his small voice telling me crackers had been enough. And then I saw their faces, my parents, calm, casual, unapologetic. That's when the rage returned. Not wild, not loud. Cold. Methodical. I didn't scream. I didn't write angry posts online. I didn't even call them. No, I did something they never expected. I started talking. Not to the world, not to strangers, but to the very people whose opinions they valued most. My Aunt Leah, who always asked why we never showed up for holidays. My cousin Mark, who once called my parents the glue of the family. Melissa, who was too caught up in being adored to notice who was being ignored. I told each of them what happened. No drama, no exaggeration, just the truth. They didn't feed Caleb for 2 days. They told him he wasn't family. I watched their faces shift, the silence stretch, the awkward attempts to make sense of something senseless. And I let it sit. I didn't beg for outrage. I didn't ask them to pick sides. I simply opened the door and let the truth walk in. Because sometimes revenge isn't loud. It doesn't need a fight or a confrontation. Sometimes it's a mirror, and all you have to do is hold it up and walk away. The ones who can bear to see themselves will change. The ones who can't will crack. Tell me, have you ever let the truth speak for you and watched how it quietly dismantled everything false? The thing about telling the truth is that it doesn't need to shout. It just needs to land in the right ears. When I told Aunt Leah, she went silent for a full minute. Then she whispered, "I always wondered why your invitations stopped coming." I could hear the way her voice cracked, not from surprise, but from recognition. Like she'd suspected something was off all along, but never had the words to name it. Now she did. And that changed everything. Next was Mark. My cousin, the one who used to idolize my parents. He called them pillars, said they hosted the best backyard cookouts, always looked so loving in family photos. I told him everything plainly. His silence came fast and hard, followed by a quiet, "You're sure?" And I said, "Ask them." He did. And the next day he texted me, "You weren't exaggerating. I'm sick to my stomach." He offered to take Caleb out for ice cream with his kids the next weekend. Said he wanted to show him what family should feel like. Even Melissa, my golden child sister, whose kids had full bedrooms in that house, paused. I didn't attack her. I didn't blame her for their favoritism. I just told her the story. Her reaction was the most complicated. She said she didn't know. That she never saw them act that way. That maybe I was interpreting things too harshly. I let her sit in that discomfort. I didn't push. I didn't defend. But I did ask her one thing. Would you be okay if it had been your son? She didn't answer that day, but I noticed her kids didn't go over the following weekend, and they haven't since. It spread slowly, like a quiet wind that slipped through cracks and under doors. No public call-outs, no explosive declarations, just conversations, just truth. And the most remarkable thing, it stuck. Because what I said wasn't colored by bitterness, it was simply undeniable. A 7-year-old child told he didn't belong and left to starve while others ate breakfast around him. You don't need to embellish that. The horror of it is already too real. I didn't do it to destroy them. I wasn't out for blood. I did it to make sure the world they built on false kindness and curated image would no longer stand on silence. Because my silence had fed their reputation for years. And now I was starving them of it. And it showed. Phone calls stopped coming. Invitations to barbecues stopped arriving. People my parents once considered friends began making excuses, withdrawing, fading into the distance. The family image they so carefully polished began to crack, and they didn't even know yet that the worst part was still coming. Because I hadn't touched the one thing they cherished most, their reflection. Now let me ask you, have you ever watched someone's world shrink? Not because you destroyed it, but because you simply stopped holding it up. It started subtly. The shift. At first I thought maybe I was imagining it. A delay in a returned call. A missed invitation. Then came confirmation. Melissa canceled her kids' next visit to our parents' house. She said they had a soccer game, but I knew better. Her voice was different, measured, tentative. She was doing the math in her head, probably picturing her own son in Caleb's chair plate. Empty eyes lowered. Whether she admitted it out loud or not, something had cracked. Then Aunt Leah told her church circle. Not with malice, but with concern. She said something during their Wednesday potluck about how appearances can be deceiving, how some people need to remember that charity starts at home. Word got around. The neighbors, the ones who always came to our parents' annual July barbecue, started asking quiet questions. People noticed Caleb hadn't been around. People noticed I hadn't been around. And when they asked why I didn't dodge, I didn't rant. I just said they didn't feed my son for 2 days, said he wasn't family, and then I watched it happen. The pause. That pause is powerful. It's not the gasp of gossip. It's the stillness of processing, of realizing something you thought was polished is actually hollow. That's what people did. They paused. And when they resumed, they were different. Conversations at church skipped over my parents. Invitations quietly excluded them. Melissa told me that Mom had started baking extra just to drop off goodies at neighbors' houses, something she never did before. She was trying to patch the image, but the cracks had already spread beneath the surface. 3 days after Melissa's canceled visit, my parents called. First, it was my mom. Her voice was sharp, brittle. "Why are people ignoring us?" she asked, like I had orchestrated some grand scheme. I didn't answer. She went on more frantic. "Did you tell them something?" "What did you say?" Still, I stayed silent. I could hear her breathing through the phone, confused by the silence she once weaponized now being turned back on her. Then my father left a voicemail. "You're ruining our name." Over what some crackers, I listened to it twice. Once to hear his words, and again to hear what was missing: remorse. He wasn't sorry they starved Caleb. He was angry they got caught. I deleted the voicemail. I didn't need his voice echoing in my house anymore. The irony was almost poetic. For years, they had thrived off attention, off admiration, curated perception, neighborly praise. Now they were starving not from lack of food, but from lack of affirmation. And I hadn't raised my voice once. I didn't destroy their world. I just stopped feeding it. And that silence, it was louder than any confrontation I could have staged. So I ask you, have you ever taken your power back? Not by fighting, but by letting the truth starve the lie. By the end of that week, the silence they once prized had become unbearable for them. They weren't used to being ignored. They weren't used to phone calls going unanswered, neighbors crossing the street instead of waving, church friends replying with polite coldness instead of open arms. Their world, built on pristine appearances and tight social choreography, had lost its audience. And without an audience, they didn't know who to be. The messages started coming faster. First, a few scattered texts. Then, long voicemails, each one a variation of the same desperate theme: control slipping. "You're punishing us over a misunderstanding," my mother said in one, her tone laced with exhaustion but no apology. "This isn't healthy." As if I was the one acting irrational. As if feeding a child was negotiable. Then came my father's voice, sharp, defensive, confused. "If you're going to ruin our reputation, at least let us explain our side." Their side. Like there were two versions of leaving a child unfed for 2 days. But I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in arguments or excuses. I wasn't playing their game anymore. They'd always taught me that image was more important than integrity. That silence was the price of inclusion. But now that silence was starving them, and they were scrambling for scraps of sympathy from the very people who once admired them. It didn't matter that I hadn't gone public. I hadn't posted a single word online. All I had done was speak plainly to the people whose approval they fed off. That alone was enough to turn the tide. I started noticing their discomfort leaking into public. A mutual friend mentioned my mother had brought up family drama during a women's Bible study group. Said she just didn't understand why some people are so sensitive these days. My father tried to joke about it at a cookout. "Kids today are so entitled, am I right?" But it didn't land. The room went quiet. The jokes no longer protected them. Meanwhile, Caleb was starting to heal in the quiet way children do. He laughed a little more. Ate without hesitation. Asked questions about the world again. But when I asked if he wanted to talk about what happened, he still shook his head. He was processing in his own time, and I respected that. I also knew I wasn't done. Because while their reputation was beginning to erode, I hadn't yet touched what they valued most. That would come later. But for now, I let them sit in the discomfort. Let them feel what it meant to lose something they thought they'd always control. One morning, I replayed a voicemail from my mother where she cried not because she regretted what they did, but because people had stopped inviting them. Her sobs weren't grief for Caleb. They were grief for the version of herself she could no longer sell to others. That was when I knew they weren't sorry. They were exposed. So tell me, have you ever realized someone's tears weren't for what they did, but for being seen doing it? The thing about starvation is it's never just about food. Hunger comes in many forms. For my parents, it had always been about admiration, influence, control. They thrived on being needed, respected, envied. Every cookie platter at church, every comment about how put together their home was, every holiday photo sent out like a campaign ad, it was all food for their ego. And now they were starving. Not from lack of meals, but from the cold vacuum left behind when people stopped pretending they were something they weren't. They thought the worst had passed, that the ripple would fade. But they didn't realize I was just getting started. Because it wasn't enough to let people see the truth. I needed them to feel it. To understand that what they had done wasn't just a crack in the family dynamic. It was a fundamental betrayal. A fracture that could never be glued back together with tearful voicemails or self-pity. So I made a decision. I wouldn't let Caleb grow up believing that people like them could hurt and walk away clean. I wouldn't let silence cover what needed sunlight. And I wouldn't let their version of the story become the only one that lived in the minds of the people around us. But I wasn't going to scream it from rooftops. No. I'd do what they never expected. I'd be still methodical, exact. And I would starve them of the one thing they had always taken for granted: access. No more birthday cards signed "Love Grandma" and Grandpa. No more updates, no photos, no visits. No chance to rewrite history later with sentimental gestures. I stripped them from our narrative like peeling wallpaper off a wall I was rebuilding from scratch. They had chosen exclusion when they told a child he wasn't family. I was just honoring that choice with permanence. I cleared out the last few heirlooms they had given me. Tucked away the framed photos that included them. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. I was no longer pretending. I had spent too much of my life twisting myself into someone digestible for them. Now they could choke on the emptiness. One afternoon, while sipping coffee in my kitchen, I thought back to something my father used to say whenever someone in town had a falling out with their children. Ungrateful kids, he'd scoff. Always rewriting the story. And now here I was rewriting the story. Not out of ungratefulness, but out of truth. And the difference was this version wouldn't skip the parts that hurt. By the time they realized how far they'd fallen out of the narrative, it was too late. Their calls went unanswered, their messages unopened, their social calendar blank. And I didn't need to lift a finger. All I had to do was walk away and mean it. So I leave you with this. Have you ever stopped feeding someone's illusion only to watch them wither from the truth they can't digest? I was doing dishes when the memory hit me sharp and uninvited. I was 15, standing in the living room in a dress I'd saved weeks for holding a birthday gift for my best friend, when my mother stopped me at the door. "You can't go?" she said, not even looking up from her tea set. Why, I asked, confused. She placed a porcelain cup on a doily and said, "I need help polishing the china. My club guests are coming tomorrow. This family needs to look put together." I didn't argue. I put the gift down, changed into an apron, and spent the evening buffing glass that hadn't been touched in years. That moment had been buried in the back of my mind like so many others until now. But as I stood in my own kitchen watching Caleb build a fort out of couch cushions and paperbacks, it surfaced with full force. And I realized something. My mother wasn't grieving the loss of our connection. She was grieving the collapse of her reflection, the image she spent her whole life protecting. And if image was what she loved most, then that's where I'd begin. It wasn't about revenge in the way most people imagine it. I didn't want to scream at them in public or confront them at a family gathering. That would have made me look like the bitter daughter they always tried to paint me as. No, I wanted to be precise. Surgical. I didn't want to ruin them, I wanted to reveal them. Because sometimes all it takes to collapse a legacy is to turn on the light and let people see the cracks for themselves. So I waited. I marked the date of their annual community fundraiser on my calendar. It was a charity BBQ for the local firehouse, a neighborhood tradition. My father loved it. He flipped burgers in a chef's apron, shaking hands like a politician. My mother floated around with lemonade and compliments, greeting people by name, complimenting their grandkids. It was their one shining moment of the year, their chance to perform goodness on a stage of picnic tables and red-checkered tablecloths. And I wasn't going to be there. But someone else would. There's an old saying, if you want truth to shake a room, let it come from a quiet mouth. So I called someone they hadn't thought about in years. Mrs. Eileen Carlton, my 4th grade teacher. She was sweet, forgetful, and most importantly, still very active on social media. Once after a parent-teacher conference, she told me in a low voice, "You're a thoughtful girl, even if your parents seem more concerned with show than soul." I never forgot that. Now I was giving her a chance to see how right she'd been. I didn't ask her to make a scene. I just told her what happened, told her the truth. They didn't feed Caleb for 2 days, I said. They told him he wasn't family. Her response was soft. "What kind of people do that?" I answered calmly. "The kind who throw charity barbecues while starving a child under their roof." And I wonder, have you ever realized the most powerful witness to injustice might be the one who's been watching all along? The RSVP list was usually a point of pride for my mother. She curated it like a wedding planner, down to who brought what, who sat where, and which neighbors were worth a second plate of brisket. So when she saw a familiar name on the list that year, Mrs. Eileen Carlton, she probably thought it was a harmless fluke, a sweet retired teacher coming out for free lemonade and overcooked hot dogs. She wouldn't have guessed that Eileen wasn't there for nostalgia. She was there for revelation. I didn't show up that day. I didn't need to. I had already done my part. I had lit the match, I just wasn't the one standing by when the smoke started curling through the perfect hedges and rose bushes. Eileen showed up 10 minutes after the grill was fired. She wore a bright yellow t-shirt that read in bold navy letters, "Family feeds, even when it's hard." It wasn't subtle, but it was kind. That's what made it land harder. It didn't scream. It asked. My mother greeted her near the lemonade stand, smile plastered on as always. "Eileen, it's been ages. I didn't know you still followed our events." Eileen smiled back, but there was a different glint in her eye, sharp, steady. "So sorry I didn't bring my grandson," she said loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "I assumed children were only welcome if they're blood relatives. Or does that still not count in this house?" It hung in the air like a thunderclap. Conversations around them slowed, then stopped. My mom blinked, then laughed a tight, uncomfortable chuckle. "Oh, you're always such a firecracker." But she was already flushed. Her hand tightened around the lemonade pitcher. My father, manning the grill a few feet away, glanced over, his eyes narrowing when he saw the shirt. He must have known instantly. Eileen wasn't just a guest. She was a spotlight. And she had just turned to face them full beam. She didn't need to say anything else. She didn't need to raise her voice or storm out. She simply mingled, smiling, shaking hands, asking people how their families were. And everywhere she went, the message on her shirt went with her. I'd given her no script, no plan, just the truth, and she wore it without fear. Later that afternoon, 2 more guests' neighbors I'd quietly spoken with brought it up during the community speech. One leaned over to another and said, just loud enough, "Hard to preach community when you can't feed your own blood." Another asked, "Is it true what I heard about the grandson?" And that was all it took. A few phrases, a few eyes darting, A few heads turning at just the right moment. No shouting, no drama, just sunlight. And sunlight, when it falls on something that's been polished too long in the dark, reveals every flaw. So I ask you, have you ever seen the truth land so quietly that no one could look away? If my parents had expected applause that day, what they got instead was something far more unsettling: silence. Not the polite kind, not the inattentive kind, but the kind that says we heard and we're thinking. It started small. The way conversations broke off when my mother entered a circle. How neighbors once eager to praise the garden or ask for parenting tips now smiled tight-lipped and quickly excused themselves. She floated through her backyard like a ghost in her own play, still trying to hit the marks, but the audience was no longer playing along. And then there was the t-shirt. Mrs. Eileen Carlton wore it proudly, moving among tables like a woman on a mission, even if her only mission was visibility. That navy print family feeds, even when it's hard, seemed to follow my parents like a shadow. It asked nothing. It accused no one. But it lingered. People read it once, then again. They glanced at my mother at the guest list, then back at Eileen. The connection formed faster than I could have imagined. My father, ever the handler, tried to regain the narrative. During his speech, normally filled with corny jokes and firehouse stats, he fumbled. His voice cracked once, then twice. He tried to lift the energy. "We're all family here," he said at one point, forced and hollow. It landed with a thud. Nobody clapped. Someone coughed. A child dropped a plastic fork. And still that shirt stood at the back of the crowd, bright as the sun. Later, a few women from my mother's volunteer circle gathered near the dessert table, whispering. One of them, whom I'd never spoken to, looked directly at my mother and asked, "Is your grandson doing okay? I didn't see him here." The question was sharp, but polite, designed to sound like concern. My mother blinked. "He's fine," she said. "He's just busy." It was a lie, and they knew it. You could see it in the way they nodded without smiling, the way they exchanged glances and didn't press further. The wall had cracked. That's the thing about curated lives. They rely on everyone else's cooperation. It only takes one unexpected truth to unravel the whole tapestry. And that t-shirt, that one phrase. It was the loose thread I had been waiting to tug. After the event, my father posted photos online, like nothing had changed: group shots, smiling faces, lemonade flags. But the comments were fewer. The likes slower. The usual compliments about being such a strong family noticeably absent. They had performed the show. But the audience no longer believed the script. And I hadn't needed to raise my voice once. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. I didn't even attend. I just let someone else wear the truth out loud. So I ask you, have you ever watched someone's mask slip so quietly that even they didn't hear it fall? That night, my mother called me 3 times. I didn't answer. I let the phone ring, then watched the screen fade to black. On the 4th call, she left a voicemail. Her voice was strained, caught between anger and fear. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she said, "but you're humiliating us." For what? For some misunderstanding. You're blowing things out of proportion. I replayed the message once, then again. Not once did she say Caleb's name. Not once did she ask how he was. It wasn't remorse. It was damage control. My father tried a different tactic. He called from a different number and left a calmer message. "You've made your point," he said. "Now you need to stop. You're turning people against us." That line hung in my chest like ice. You're turning people against us. As if truth had to be twisted to be dangerous. As if accountability was an act of aggression. But here's the thing, I wasn't turning anyone. I was simply letting people turn themselves once they saw what lay beneath the paint. For so long, my parents had mastered the art of control. The polite smile, the neighborly favor, the well-timed donation. And for just as long I had played the obedient daughter, afraid to rattle the illusion. But illusions crack under weight. And what I carried now wasn't anger. It was clarity. And that weighs more than rage ever could. I didn't respond to their messages. I didn't explain myself. I didn't argue. I knew them well enough to know what silence meant to them. It was the one thing they couldn't weaponize. It left them exposed, without a script, without something to push back against. Melissa texted me a few days later. "They're freaking out," she wrote. "Mom's baking like crazy. Dad's talking about suing someone." Then she paused before adding, "But they haven't denied it. Not once." That part said more than anything else. They weren't arguing the facts. They were mourning the consequences. At the next community meeting, my parents showed up late and left early. My mother wore sunglasses indoors. My father didn't speak unless spoken to. They looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but diminished. Like performers caught mid-act with the curtain torn down. And the town didn't yell at them, didn't shame them publicly. It was worse than that. They simply stopped clapping. I think that's when it started to sink in, that no amount of cookies, smiles, or community service hours would erase what had been revealed, that the applause they lived on had quieted, that their image was no longer something they could polish into perfection. And all I had done was let the spotlight move an inch to the left. So let me ask, have you ever seen someone unravel, not because they were attacked, but because the mask no longer fit? It came on a Thursday. I was folding laundry when the phone rang, and for the first time in weeks, I answered. Not because I wanted to talk, but because I was ready to end it. My father's voice came through the line, but it wasn't the voice I grew up fearing. It was thinner now. Weaker, like someone standing in a house with no doors calling out into rooms that no longer answered back. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "We're your parents." I let that sentence sit, let it echo. Then I replied, calm and clear, "No. You're Melissa's parents. You made that clear when you chose who mattered at your table." He was quiet for a long time. Then he tried again. "We raised you." I laughed, but there was no joy in it. "You tolerated me. There's a difference." He didn't argue, didn't deny. Just sighed like a man who finally realized the script was no longer working. I didn't hang up. I waited. A few hours later, my mother left her final message. No accusations this time, no demands, just tears. "I made a mistake," she said. "I didn't think it would spread. I didn't think people would stop inviting us. That was the tell. Not I didn't think I hurt Caleb. Not I didn't realize what I was doing was cruel. Just I didn't think we'd be caught." It wasn't an apology. It was mourning the death of an identity she'd spent decades crafting. And in that moment, I understood something I'd never had words for before. She wasn't grieving what she'd done. She was grieving who she couldn't pretend to be anymore. That night, I sat with Caleb on the couch. He was reading, his feet tucked under a blanket. I looked at him, this small, resilient person who had endured a wound he couldn't fully name. I thought about how easily he might have believed he didn't matter. How that belief might have grown inside him like a seed if I hadn't pulled him out of that house when I did. And I made myself another promise: he would never again question his worth based on someone else's broken definition of family. I went into my closet, pulled out the last photo album that still had my parents in it, and flipped through the pages. Weddings, holidays, birthday parties where I stood at the edge of the frame. Then I closed it. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was done. For real this time. Some people think revenge is a fire, but the real kind, the kind that sticks, is just a door closing, quietly, finally, and locking from the inside. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever walked away from someone, not because you stopped loving them, but because they never truly tried to love you back? They always said the house would stay in the family forever. It was their mantra, their legacy, their crown jewel. A pristine colonial-style home with white columns, brick chimney and rose bushes so precisely trimmed they looked artificial. My father used to brag that it had been in the family since his grandfather laid the first brick. "This house is proof," he'd say. "Proof we did something right." but no one said what exactly that something was. Growing up, I thought the house was beautiful. Until I realized it wasn't the home I missed, it was the childhood I never had inside it. As an adult, every time I drove past it, the house looked bigger, colder, emptier, like it had been waiting to become a museum of denial. And after everything with Caleb, it was no longer a symbol of pride. It was a shrine to a story that never existed. What they didn't expect, what they couldn't fathom, was that I would take from them the one thing they loved more than their image: the meaning behind those walls. Not with a fire, not with scandal, but with emptiness. The visits stopped. The holidays stopped. Melissa's kids didn't come around. No grandkids in the yard. No more birthday parties with banners strung across the porch. The shutters stayed closed. The driveway, once full, sat empty for days at a time. They tried to act like it was by choice, that they were downsizing their commitments. But everyone knew. Even the mailman stopped pretending it was business as usual. A friend of mine who lived nearby texted me a photo one day. The once perfect lawn had grown patchy. The roses drooped. The welcome mat was gone. All that was left was the shell. And inside it, two people who had once sat at a breakfast table and told a child he wasn't theirs. And it struck me they had fed their pride more than they had fed their grandson. They had watered appearances while starving relationships. Now they were living in exactly what they had built: an empty house where love was always conditional, and silence meant power. I didn't need to tear anything down. The termites had already been living in the foundation. All I did was stop pretending the structure could still hold. And now, as they sat in the echo of their choices, I knew the one truth that would haunt them more than any headline ever could: we were never coming back. I hadn't touched the bricks or the paint. I had just taken away the laughter, the future, the family. And in doing so, I turned their forever home into nothing more than a monument to absence. So tell me, have you ever watched someone sit inside the very thing they once worshipped only to realize it had never truly loved them back? They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but some pictures speak louder in silence. I spent a quiet evening going through old photo albums, years of images where I stood just off to the side where Melissa was always front and center, and Caleb barely existed. I pulled out each photo carefully. The ones where I was a prop. The ones where my parents smiled for the lens but never turned that smile toward me. Then I cropped them. I didn't cut with anger. I cut with precision. I removed their faces, their arms around others, their presence in moments that no longer belonged to them. What remained were memories reclaimed. Caleb on his first day of school, wearing his dinosaur backpack. Me holding his hand at the zoo, both of us laughing at something that had nothing to do with them. These were our moments, untainted, pure ours. I had them printed on thick, glossy paper. Each image a declaration: this is family, not based on blood or obligation, but on love and presence. Then I placed them in a simple box. No ribbon, no return address, just a package left at their front door. Tucked on top of the stack was a letter handwritten, just a few sentences long. This is your family now, in pictures only. Look at them as long as you want, because that's the closest you'll ever get again. You fed your pride more than you fed my child. You called him a visitor. Now you're strangers. This house will stay in the family forever. No. The family left the house and it's just a shell now. I sealed the box and walked away. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't check for delivery confirmation. But a week later, Melissa called. Her voice was unusually quiet. I stopped by, she said. They didn't answer the door. Curtains were drawn. The yard looks rough. I said nothing. She added, Mom keeps trying to get people to come over. Nobody wants to. Dad walks around the house in slippers. Doesn't talk much anymore. Good. That meant they were finally living like Caleb did for those 2 days, unseen, unheard, and forgotten. Not because anyone hated them, but because they had chosen pride over connection, and now they were reaping what they planted. Melissa hesitated before continuing. They were raised different, you know, she said, her voice faltering. I looked out the window. So was I replied. But I don't starve kids and call it discipline. She didn't argue. She didn't say another word. And that silence told me everything. There would be no defense, no healing, only distance. And somehow I felt at peace. Because the pictures I kept, the ones still framed on my wall, were of a life I built, not one I escaped. So tell me, have you ever returned something broken? Not out of revenge, but to remind someone what they'll never hold again. It was Melissa who became the last bridge between them and the outside world. She didn't agree with everything I did, but she didn't fight it either. She lingered in the middle, torn between comfort and conscience. So when she called and said she was thinking of stopping by their house to check in, I didn't stop her. I didn't warn her. Some things have to be seen to be understood. She went the next day. When she called me after, her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. I don't know how to explain it, she said. The house. It felt like a tomb. I waited. It's dark inside. Curtains drawn, mail piled up on the table. I rang the doorbell 3 times before Dad opened it. He didn't say much, just stared at me like he forgot what company looked like. I could hear her breathing on the other end, steady but shaken. They're not well. There was a pause. I didn't fill it. Then she added, Mom keeps asking why no one calls. She mentioned you. Said you're punishing them. I almost laughed, but it caught in my throat. Punishment would have been easier, I said. This is just consequence. Melissa was quiet again, and I wondered if she was starting to see the full picture, not just the isolated act of neglect, but the entire pattern stretching back decades. The selective love, the conditional praise, the hierarchy of worth they built and maintained, one quiet cut at a time. They keep asking when you're bringing Caleb by, she said finally. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. She continued slower this time, like each word cost something. They miss him. I think they miss being admired more than they miss him, but they feel it. The absence. That was the truth, plain and sharp. My parents didn't miss Caleb because they loved him. They missed the symbol of him, the idea of being good grandparents, being seen as generous, loving, noble. They missed what he represented in photo albums and Sunday brunch stories. But the real child, the real boy with soft eyes and peanut butter sandwiches and a laugh that filled a room, that child they had discarded. And now that the audience had walked out, they were mourning the role, not the relationship. I don't think they'll ever change, Melissa said. Her voice cracked. But I think they know they lost something they can't get back. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Good, I said. Because maybe now they'll finally understand what they made me feel all those years. Replaceable, invisible, forgotten. She never brought it up again. Some truths don't need to be repeated. They just echo. So I ask you, have you ever watched someone mourn the image of love they destroyed, but never the person they hurt? It had been months since we last spoke of them. Caleb had healed slowly in the way only children can, through laughter, routine, and the quiet magic of being seen. He no longer hesitated before asking for a snack. No longer looked around the table before taking the first bite. He was growing back into himself, inch by inch, like a tree that had weathered its first storm and now reached gently toward sunlight. Then, one afternoon as we were driving home from the library, he looked out the window and said softly, "Can we drive by their house?" I glanced at him. Why? He shrugged, eyes still on the road ahead. I just want to see it. I didn't answer right away. My instinct was to protect him from the memories, from the weight of disappointment, from the possibility of reopening something that had finally started to close. But then I realized maybe he didn't want to step back into pain. Maybe he just wanted to look at it, to name it, to release it. So we drove. We turned onto the familiar street, once trimmed like a postcard, now overgrown and tired. The rose bushes my mother had once pruned with surgical precision were tangled, unkept. The paint on the mailbox chipped. A curtain shifted as we pulled up across the street, but no one came out. We sat in the car in silence. Caleb stared. His face was unreadable at first. Not sad, not angry, just still. Then he leaned his head against my shoulder and whispered, "Does anyone live there?" I kept my eyes forward. "Not really," I said. He didn't ask anything more. He didn't point, didn't wave. Just watched for another minute, then closed his eyes like he was saying goodbye to something too young to hold anger but old enough to remember. That moment wasn't loud. There were no speeches, no tears. Just the stillness of a child reclaiming something that had once confused him. He leaned back and said, "I'm not hungry anymore." I kissed the top of his head and whispered, "I know, baby. Neither am I." And I meant it. Not just the hunger for revenge, or justice, or closure, but the hunger to be acknowledged by people who never truly saw us. It was gone, replaced by something steadier, quieter. A peace born not from forgiveness, but from freedom. We drove away without looking back. The house faded in the rearview mirror like a memory that had finally accepted its place. So I ask you, have you ever stood before the place that broke you? Not to relive it, but to prove it no longer holds you. We didn't talk on the drive home. Caleb looked out the window, lost in thought, and I let the silence stretch between us. Not the sharp silence my parents used to wound, but the kind that wraps around you like a blanket after a long day. The kind that says, "We're okay now." When we pulled into the driveway, he got out, first backpack slung over one shoulder, and ran up the porch steps with that quiet confidence he'd been rebuilding. I stood there for a moment, longer, looking up at the sky as the sun began to lower, casting long shadows that didn't feel threatening anymore. Just soft reminders of a day ending. Inside, I reheated leftover pasta while Caleb sat at the table with a pencil in hand, sketching something on a piece of scrap paper. I didn't ask what it was. I didn't need to. Some things children draw just to make sense of the world. Others they draw to let it go. Either way, I knew it was his way of putting the day down. We ate in peace. No one reached for more than their share. No one measured love in silence. He asked for seconds. I smiled and gave them. Later that night, after he'd brushed his teeth and climbed into bed, he called for me. "Mom," I came in. "Yes, sweetheart," he hesitated, then whispered, "Thanks for taking me to see it." I nodded, brushing the hair from his forehead. "You're welcome. And thanks for not making me go inside." I sat on the edge of his bed. "You never have to go back to any place that made you feel small," I said. "Not ever." He nodded and closed his eyes. A few minutes later, I heard his breath slow into the rhythm of sleep. I sat there a little longer, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how much had changed, not out in the world, but inside our own small one. I used to think revenge had to be fire and fury, that justice needed to be declared, shouted, branded across the sky. But sitting in that dim room, hearing Caleb breathe deeply in sleep, I understood something else. Sometimes the real victory is quiet. It looks like a child who no longer flinches when he asks for what he needs. Like a woman who no longer waits for the phone to ring. Like a dinner table where hunger, emotional or otherwise, no longer has a seat. They say you can't choose your family, but you can choose who you starve and who you feed. And I had made my choice. So here's my final question for you. Have you ever realized the moment you stopped craving their approval was the moment you finally felt full? Sometimes the worst hunger isn't in your stomach. It's in your heart, waiting for someone to say you matter. If you're a parent and you've ever made a child feel less, then I hope you think twice. Because children remember. Silence echoes. And love withheld becomes a wound they carry for years. I didn't choose revenge to destroy. I chose it to protect, to end the cycle, and to build something stronger. Have you ever lived a story like mine? One where silence screamed louder than words? What did you do? What would you do differently now? Tell me in the comments. If this story meant something to you, please like, subscribe, and share. The most powerful revenge is building a life that no longer needs approval. Thank you for listening.